Hi, John McElroy here, talking all things automotive. Today, I want to talk about CO2 emission standards for the automotive industry and what it's doing to the industry, why I think it's unfair, and why I think it's ineffective. Now, let me start out by saying I'm all in favor of reducing CO2 emissions. In fact, let's call it greenhouse gas emissions because it includes more than just CO2. I personally believe that greenhouse gases are causing global warming to accelerate in a way that's going to be a real problem for society, especially deeper into this century. So we've got to do something about it. But so far, it's the auto industry that's carrying almost the entire burden. As I said before, it's unfair to single out the auto industry, and it's not effective. No other industry or sector of the economy is being forced into these kinds of regulations with the kinds of fines that come with them. We're talking about automakers spending billions of dollars in fine. You know, environmentalists like to say, well, transportation is the biggest source of greenhouse gas emissions. And so we have to regulate cars. But let's dig into the EPA data and see what's really going on. Look at this chart. Yes, transportation is the biggest source of greenhouse gases, but not by much. And it's only 28%, or a little over a quarter of the problem. And so let's look at this chart too that shows not just by sector, but each sector using energy. And now you'll see that if you include electricity and use in indirect emissions, transportation is no longer the biggest source. It's the third biggest source. Okay, they are very close together, but now residential, commercial, and industry are bigger sources of greenhouse gas emissions than the auto industry. Here's another thing. Let's look at what the EPA says about greenhouse gas emissions within the transportation sector. And what you see is that light vehicles account for 57% of greenhouse gases. Well, remember, we're talking about 28% of the total, and now 57% of that is what light vehicles create. So 57% of 28% is 16%. So that's what light cars and trucks account for 16% of total greenhouse gas emissions. Like I like to say is, what are we doing about the other 84%? And let's go back to transportation just for the second. You know, when environmentalists like to talk about transportation being the biggest source of greenhouse gas or CO2 emissions, well, transportation includes ships. Do ships face big regulations and fines for these kinds of emissions? No, absolutely not. How about the airlines? I mean, the airlines, of course, they pollute a lot, right? So what kind of regulations and fines do they face? None. None whatsoever. How about buses, like buses in the city or going between states or what? No, they don't face them either, nor do motorcycles, nor does mining equipment. So we're putting all of the onus on light cars and trucks in the automotive industry. And even when you look at other sectors, you know, certainly the agricultural sector faces all kinds of greenhouse gas emission regulations and fines, right? No, none whatsoever. What about electric generation? No, they don't. There's talk about imposing some regulations and potential fines on them in the 2030s, but actually that was talked about in the Biden administration. It's probably going to go away with the Trump administration. And residential or commercial, I mean, when have you ever faced any kind of regulation for the GHGs that you're generating at home or at work? There's no regulations for that because there would be a massive political blowback if there was. So, how can we possibly solve global warming when the auto industry is the only industry that's being heavily regulated and fined to do something about it? In fact, European automakers and suppliers wrote a letter to the EU this week saying they've had it with Europe's CO2 regulations. They have spent 250 billion euros coming out with electric cars. They've launched hundreds of EV models, and yet they're coming nowhere near to the goals that they have to hit. Right now, EV market share in Europe is stuck at around 15% of the market. But by 2030, European automakers have to cut their CO2 emissions by 55%. By 2035, they have to eliminate them 100%, i.e., go full electric. What they're saying is, we can't do it. We're not going to get there. We need to get rid of these regulations. There is good news that is going on. So in the United States, greenhouse gas emissions peaked in 2005, and they've been dropping ever since. They're now 20% below what they were in 2005. And yet, get this, there are now 44 million more people living in the U.S., and since 2005, the U.S. economy has more than doubled. Back in 2005, U.S. GNP was about $13.6 trillion. Today, it's over $29 trillion. So to get a 20% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions at the same time that the economy more than doubled with 44 million more people living in the country is quite an accomplishment. EVs can help reduce greenhouse gas emissions, but they're not going to be part of the solution. They are part of the solution. They're not the solution. I like to cite a study from the Transportation Energy Institute, which did a very comprehensive study comparing the total life cycle emissions of EVs versus ICE vehicles. And I mean comprehensive. They looked at what it takes to mine all the materials to make batteries and electric motors, and shipping those materials around the world to get processed, ultimately assembling them into electric vehicles, selling those, having people use them, having them charge, all the electricity that went into charging them, even electricity generated from coal, all of that went into it, all the way to recycling, including all the energy that goes into recycling. And they found that EVs are cleaner. In fact, EVs will cut emissions in half compared to internal combustion vehicles. But it's in half, right? So it doesn't get rid of all of them. You can't say that EVs are zero emission vehicles. They're not. They're a big improvement, but they only get rid of half of what's going on there. So in the big scheme of things, when you look at the fact that light vehicles account for 16% of total GHGs, going full electric would cut that down to 8%. So we're not really even coming close to solving the problem. As like I said, I'm all for fighting climate change. I'm all for reducing GHGs, but singling out the automotive industry with enormous regulatory regulations and having billions of dollars in fine is not going to solve anything. That's why I say the auto industry cannot solve the CO2 problem. Do you want to see the automotive industry grow and thrive? So do we. That's why we dedicate our shows to providing the people in the industry with important data and information, and access to the people who are driving the industry forward with the guests that we bring on our shows and the interviews that we conduct. But we need your help to continue doing it. That's why I'm asking you to support Autoline with a YouTube or Patreon membership. It'll get you extra content that will be available only to members, but it will especially make sure that you and Autoline continue to drive the automotive industry forward.